Helen Keller, Chapter 5, Water, Water. "Miss Kate, I want to take Helen away with me," Annie said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Keller. "I must teach Helen to mind me," Annie explained, "but I can't do it here in this house. Every time I try, she turns to you and away from me. More and more she will think of me as an enemy. Then everything will be lost." Mrs. Keller didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. Annie tried again. "It will be just for a while, just until Helen learns that I am a part of her life too." "There's a little garden house near here," Mrs. Keller said slowly, but she still didn't say yes. Annie leaned forward. "I know it's a gamble," she said softly. "It's also our last chance." "Last chance?" Mrs. Keller sat very still for a moment, then she nodded yes. So Helen and Annie went to live in the little house on the other side of the garden. At first Helen kicked and screamed and fought as hard as ever, but slowly there came a change. Helen still fought, but not as hard, and not as often. Sometimes she would even let the stranger hold her for a moment. Then one day Helen didn't fight at all. "The first great step has been taken," Annie wrote a friend. "Helen has learned how to mind me." But Helen still didn't know what words were. Day after day, Annie spelled into Helen's hand, and Helen learned to make more and more shapes back. By the end of March, in less than 2 weeks, she could make 21 word shapes. The next day she learned how to make 8 more, but she still didn't know what they meant. It was just a game she played with her hands. April 5th, 1887 began like any other day. After breakfast, Annie began to spell into Helen's hand, but Helen was restless this morning. The window was open and the smells of spring came pouring in. Besides, Helen was growing very tired of this game with no meaning. She tugged on Annie's skirt, then pointed to the window. Her meaning was very clear. "Let's go out." At first Annie tried to go on with the lesson, but Helen's face darkened. Her hands clenched into fists. She was holding her new doll in her lap. Now she picked it up and threw it as hard as she could. It broke into many small pieces. Helen didn't care. She didn't love the doll anyway. She felt the stranger sweep up the pieces. Then the stranger handed her her hat. So Helen knew they were going outside after all. She skipped and danced by the stranger's side. No more lessons. She was getting her own way. Or was she? Helen and Annie wandered in the garden for a while. Then they came to an old pump house. Helen liked to play in its cool dampness. She ran inside. In the middle of the floor stood a pump. Annie Sullivan began to move its handle up and down. Soon a steady stream of water came pouring out of its spout. Now she took Helen's hand and held it under the cool flow. "Water," she spelled into Helen's wet palm. At first Helen pulled away, but then suddenly she stopped. A new light seemed to come to her face. Annie saw the look. "Water," she spelled quickly. "Water. W-A-T. Helen began to spell back. Here's the picture. And with each movement her face grew brighter, for suddenly she knew the shapes that the stranger were making with her fingers did have a meaning. Everything had a name. Everything in the whole world had a name, and she could learn them all. "Oh, yes, Helen," Annie whispered. "That's it." And she bent down to hug the shaking little girl. But Helen pulled away. She didn't have time for that now. She dropped to the ground and thumped on it hard. "Name it," she was demanding. So, laughing, sobbing, Annie did. Helen paused for a moment. She fluttered off the word on her fingers. She nodded. Then she whirled away again. In the next few minutes she learned 6 new words, and she knew what they meant. Then suddenly Helen stopped. She thumped herself across the head. Annie burst out laughing. "Yes, dear," she said, "there's a word for you too." And she bent down and spelled Helen, Helen, into the little girl's hand. Helen had a name at last. Now Helen reached out and patted Annie's arm. At first Annie thought she was just saying thank you, but Helen wanted something more from that. She patted Annie's arm again. "Oh," said Annie, "so you want to know that too." And Annie spelled Teacher, teacher, into Helen's waiting hand. A few minutes later, 2 new people came out of the pump house. The wild little girl was gone, and so was the stranger. Now Helen Keller and Teacher walked hand in hand. The end of that chapter.